Good evening to you both, and let's begin with continued market uncertainty after U.S. President Donald Trump partially reversed course Wednesday on his global trade war.
I'm honored to have done it, and look, nothing's over yet, but we have a tremendous amount of spirit from other countries, including China. China wants to make a deal. They just don't know how quite to go about it.
Trump announced an immediate 90-day pause on levies after days of market turmoil, leaving a 10% baseline tariff in place. For China, though, he raised the charge well north of 100%. And while the U.S. president has reversed course on some countries, duties already facing Canada won't be changing. Duane, I'll start with you. While markets shot up Wednesday with a 90-day pause announcement, many were back trading in negative territory today. How much of a victory lap should the U.S. president be taking this week?
Yeah, there was a little bit of a spike after he paused it, but if you look and compare where the markets are today versus where the markets were before the major tariff announcement, they're still down trillions of dollars in market value. Not only that, it was an embarrassing day because the poor United States trade representative was testifying into Congress. And in the middle of the testimony is when Trump's Truth Social came out announcing the pause. So the USTR didn't even know about it. That morning, you had the Secretary of Commerce and Secretary of Treasury going on about there will be no negotiations. There is no point for negotiation. We've been getting ripped off. And all of a sudden, this is about negotiation. How do you negotiate with someone who you can't trust the word of? These are not reciprocal tariffs. This has nothing to do with tariffs. This has to do with trade deficits. And they didn't even tailor them to each country's trade deficit. Now it's right across the board. So absolute confusion. And this is the United States against the world. The world.
Najib, how do you view how things played out this week? Is the 90-day pause an about face? Is it part of strategy planned all along, as maybe the Trump administration wants to present it as being?
I think it's not even about trade deficit. I think this is about wealth transfer. The people that were getting yippee, as President Trump said, was, his own wealthy friends and donors who were losing money in the stock market. And, he made sure that they gained that money back. You have to remember it may only be short blips, but in those short blips, people who have serious money in the stock market can make a lot of money if they're told in advance of what's going to happen, which is exactly what happened yesterday. And that wealth transfer continues. It started off with government efficiency, realigning funds so that they could be given to private contractors, to now manipulating the stock market so that people's investments can also now be transferred to wealthy stock owners.
Duane, what lessons do you see Canada needing to learn from this week's trade war developments? Is the U.S. response to China any kind of indicator?
No. Trump talks about there was a list of 70 countries that are begging the U.S. to negotiate separate deals with them. But noticeably, it's not who the big trading partners are. It's not the Chinese. It's not the Canadian. It's not the European Union. And the other problem is negotiate what? The vast majority of goods go tariff-free. Even the issue around milk with Canada that Trump talks about a lot, before those tariffs kick in, there are tens of thousands of liters of milk that come in tariff-free into Canada. So how do you negotiate below zero? It's not, I have no idea what Trump is trying to do because the methods keep changing. Is it about deficits? Is it about tariffs? Is it about raising revenue for the Treasury so he can pay tax cuts to Americans? Is this about bringing manufacturing back to the United States so that they can assemble iPhones and make socks and underwear again? How do you negotiate with someone where you don't know what it is that they want and it is below zero where the tariffs need to go?
Well, Najib, of course, this is still all playing out while the federal election is underway. Many of the polls indicating Conservatives continue to close the gap. Do you see that continuing now that so much attention has returned to the Trump trade war, the volatility of the global markets?
Well, it's hard to predict anything, right? I mean, who in their right mind would open a factory or to start to plan to open a factory in the U.S. when things change every day, right? Who would make that investment? As we're seeing, the big corporations aren't ready to make those investments until things stabilize. And I think this is a great wake-up call for Canada. Canada has way too long relied on the U.S. For 80, 90% of its trade, and now it has to diversify and should diversify. And again, I think that it'll continue the fact that somehow the Liberals got an economist of Carney's stature to run for leader. Is the timing was right, and everything seems to be falling into place for them. I think the polls will tighten up as they tend to do closer to election day. But I think that it'll be hard pressed, and I don't see anything coming out of the Conservative campaign to show that they're going to even catch up ground with the Liberals between now and election day.
Duane, what are you looking for now through the second half of the election campaign? 2 official debates, a week away.
Well, what has been really interesting is there hasn't been much shift in the campaign. The campaign's been going on for almost 3 weeks now. Where the shift occurred was before the campaign even started. And I'm seeing nothing to show the Liberals losing at this point. If you look at the issues of Trump, which remains the #1 issue facing Canada, there isn't, from a policy perspective, much daylight between what Carney and what Poilievre are proposing. The difference is where they put their emphasis. For Carney, it is front and center of their campaign. For the Conservatives, they only get to that point after they talk about, the decade of darkness and carbon taxes and build the homes and stop the crime. So their old playbook. And that is just killing the Conservatives. And as hostility to Trump rises, Poilievre seems to resemble Trump in his language, in the mocking of journalists, in bragging about rally sizes, in using insult nicknames. So everything that Canadians despise about Donald Trump, they look and they see similarities with Poilievre, and it is hurting their campaign. And I don't know if they've got time to shift or if they want to shift.
We heard from health economics professor and former AHS interim VP Dr. Braden Manns off the top this evening on the Smith government's announcement of shifting acute care funding from a global model to an activity-based funding model for surgeries, a change the Premier expects to drive competition within the system. Najib, how do you see these changes playing where public opinion, public sentiment is concerned? Where does it land on the radar?
Well, I think that people are slowly starting to wrap their heads around what's been going on the last few years. We're in this situation, not just because hospitals aren't efficient. It's also because the primary care structure has been underfunded and eroded over the last few years, which always results in more cases of acute care required and people getting more and more unhealthy and needing acute care. That's part of it, and as Dr. Manns mentioned, the underfunding resulting in less staff. Well, and this is a model of privatization that's done over and over again, right? You erode and underfund the public system, and then you set up publicly funded, charter surgical facilities who, will sooner, allow, if you want to jump the queue, you can pay for it yourself, which then goes towards U.S. style insurance and copay and all this kind of stuff. I mean, the writing's on the wall of where this is going and how it's being set up. And again, the fact that you're allowing private businesses to establish themselves and become viable based on public dollars in itself is questionable. But also the fact that these kinds of terms. I mean, the language is very interesting, right? Like it's efficiency, not efficacy. It's competition, not competence, right? It's a focus on profit, not quality, and you have to be very careful when you listen to these kinds of things because, as we all know, when government gets into the market of profit versus delivering quality care in things like healthcare and education and other essential services, it's always not towards a brighter future, not towards a more effective delivery of care.
Duane, what do you see making this change in acute care funding necessary from a political standpoint?
Well, what I find interesting is in the lead during the 2023 election, the Conservatives talked about public health care, and they signed off on a public health care guarantee. And subsequent to the election, we're seeing more private delivery. And as Dr. Manns rightly pointed out, you get a challenge of private delivery at lower cost of the easiest types of surgeries, but then remaining in AHS, the more complicated, more expensive surgeries. So then I will expect that we'll see data come out showing how the private firms are so much more efficient than the public sector firms, not taking into account the types of surgeries that they're doing. And we are in the midst of a major AHS scandal that reaches deep into the Premier's office and into cabinet. That's all about favoring private surgical companies. And here we have the government doubling down on that in the midst of a scandal. So much of this, to go back to our earlier discussion, is flying under the radar because of the Trump tariff threat. Is just taking up so much oxygen, and the oxygen that isn't sucking up is taken over by the Canadian election, that I don't think people are really paying attention to what is going on with healthcare in Alberta.
All right, and let's squeeze in one more quick topic. That is the introduction this week of changes to Alberta's Education Act, which the minister responsible says driven by emails from Albertans.
Primarily about making sure that we are strengthening democracy in the province and strengthening democratic principles. I think most people would agree that the voters should always have the final say over who their representative is or is not.
Under the changes, school boards will no longer be able to remove trustees due to code of conduct complaints. That will only be possible through recall votes. It is a change that comes without consultation. Duane, how do you view the implementation and necessity of these changes? What do they speak to for you?
To me, there's two things that are driving this. One is the decision of the Red Deer Catholic Board to remove one of their trustees, LaGrange, over some of her comments around transgender children. The second is, I think, efforts by Take Back Alberta to take back school boards. Take Back Alberta has made it clear that they are focusing on school board trustees, that they're able to implement their policies. And I think what they're worried about is that they will elect some, and then they'll do something outrageous and the rest of the trustees will remove them. So now they're getting cover from the provincial government to be able to say, no, if you get elected, say and do whatever you want. We've got your back. So I see the influence of Take Back Alberta here.
Najib, what do you make of this being about democratic principles and process, as we heard in the minister's clip? Where does it leave governance at the school board level?
Well, the democratic principle aspect is a sham, right? I mean, you're allowing, elected officials who may not be competent, who are not serving the best interests of the public, to serve out 4 years, right? And there's nothing democratic about that, especially since the power of incumbency shows us again and again that people get reelected, despite their performance, because there's no performance metrics in place. So, recall, I think, is a great idea, and I'm always favoring recall. The only problem is whenever they put in recall legislation, they always make the effectiveness of it, so the barriers against it, so high. Like 40% of electors have to sign up to recall a school board trustee, according to this new legislation, and that's just insurmountable for most people to get that kind of support for recall. So and we have so recall legislation around MLAs and things like that as well, right? And it's all it's so impossible to implement it, and they've made the goals of it so high, the standards of it so high, that it's impossible to implement for anyone who wants to get it done. So yeah, you can have recall legislation, but also maybe there should be some sort of a process in place to measure the performance of elected officials and their effectiveness and their ability to serve the people they were elected to serve, and we don't have anything like that.
All right, gentlemen. Duane, real quick, if you have a real quick comment.
Yeah, I was just going to add a point. Given the low voter turnout that we often see with school trustee elections, the threshold for recall is even higher than the amount of people who voted in the original election.
All right, we're out of time. Have to leave it there. Good to see you both. Thank you kindly for this.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Thanks, Najib.